My name is Jan Santerre. I am the Project Canopy Program Coordinator at the Maine Forest Service, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon to learn about the 2022 Project Canopy grants, for taking that time on this beautiful winter day, on the warmer days we've had in recent weeks. Okay, let's see, get a mute you. Okay. I have been the program coordinator at the Maine Forest Service for Project Canopy for about 14 years. Prior to that, I worked with the program as well. So I've been around for quite a few of these trainings. And I am proud to say that Project Canopy was a trendsetter. Before Zoom was ever a figment of anybody's imagination, we were doing these trainings online. We have long done these trainings using the old University of Maine system that projected out to all of the various different campuses, and we were pioneers in saving on people's travel expenses and having to attend meetings in faraway locations. So, you know, we've got this down to pretty much a science. It is a little bit dull, I won't lie. Some of the material here is a little bit boring, but we do this training all in an effort to save you any headaches down the road once you do receive a grant, and I'm hopeful that all of you do at some point, that we will save you from having to do a lot of backtracking and looking for files and documentation that you weren't aware that you needed to maintain. So I am going to hand over introductions now to Greg Lord and to Marlene LaJoy, who are here with me from the Maine Forest Service. Greg, why don't you go ahead, just quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, Greg Lord, Senior Planner here at the Maine Forest Service, and I'm just going to be kind of monitoring things and just doing technical support if we run into issues. So, Marlene, it's yours.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marlene LaJoy. I'm the Resource Administrator for the Maine Forest Service. I handle a lot of all the financial, everything financial really, the grants, which we'll cover today, and contracts and administrative things. So I've been with forestry for 5.5 years and with state government for about 30 years. So like Jan mentioned, we'll go through the grant details, so hopefully you can have good tracking when you get your grant. And back to you, Jan.
Okay, so I'm already sharing my screen, so I'm just going to fire up the PowerPoint to get going here, and just give me one moment as my screen transitions over. There we go. Okay, everybody seeing that entry slide full screen? Greg?
Yep.
Good to roll? Okay, great, thank you. So we've already covered that. So the workshop agenda for this afternoon is basically in 3 parts. I'm going to present the first 2 sections and go over what exactly Project Canopy is, and then going to roll into an overview of the grant program itself and the 2 different categories that we have. And then Marlene's going to round out the program with the rules of the road, which is a very important component of the training. And then we'll have time for questions and such as at the end. And we can also take a break between that overview and the rules of the road if anybody wants to ask questions before we switch gears. So we've already introduced ourselves, so I can quickly skip over that. I will just say that Kim Ballard is also one of our program staff. She is our outreach director at Project Canopy, and she's somebody that also is a resource to you as you're developing your grant proposals. And then we also have our district foresters out in the field. And if any of you want to know who your district forester is and want to ask them questions, please feel free to do so. Sometimes if you have very specific questions about your program, or you need more guidance than what I can necessarily provide, because I can't get too involved in helping you to develop your proposals, your district forester is a good resource to help you with those things. So first of all, what is Project Canopy? At its base, it's the state's urban and community forestry program. It is a program of the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and was designed to educate people about the benefits of trees and to assist in providing expertise to cities and towns in Maine with their community tree and forest resources. While the current program was initiated in 1990, Maine has had a shade tree program for much longer than that. Officially, our shade tree program dates back to the 1970s, and even early in the 1900s, we can find references to shade tree programs that were offered through the Maine Forest Service. What do? We work on a variety of projects, not just these grants. Those programs include things like the Maine Register of Big Trees. Quite a few people know me as the Big Tree Lady. We also run the Tree City USA program that's sponsored by the National Arbor Day Foundation. We help with Arbor Day programming and celebrations in communities. We provide educational materials, newsletters, bulletins, etc. But our primary focus is on providing education and technical support to the communities that are essentially our clients. Our objectives to help towns and communities throughout the state of Maine to develop and maintain long-term community forestry plans in order to maximize on the benefits that trees and forests provide to us. We do that through technical assistance, and then we also do that through, more organized education and training. We provide training for municipal staff, community groups, volunteers, and a variety of workshops through other organizations as well. So some basics on the grants for this year. We have more money than we normally do, which is a really good thing for all of you. And I do expect there will be a healthy level of competition, but we have $175,000 available, which is at least $25,000 more than any recent years. And in many years, we only have half of that. So we have a good, healthy amount of money available. The grants are divided into 2 different grant categories, and those grant categories are based on the objectives that you may have. The first, most straightforward of the grant categories is the planting and maintenance grant, and that covers things like tree planting, maintenance on existing trees, and removal of existing trees. The maximum award grantees can receive in the planting and maintenance grant category is $8,000. The second category for planning and education awards a maximum of $10,000 and focuses on development of those long-term and sustainable community tree programs that I mentioned before. Programs to develop things like inventories and management plans, or to develop education campaigns to help inform citizens of the importance of your street and shade tree population. Some of the basics of the grants. Who's eligible? These grants are only eligible to entities that serve the public, so state, county, and municipal governments, as well as educational institutions and nonprofit environmental organizations. The key here, again, is they need to be organizations that serve the public. Land needs to be accessible to the public. Trees where they're planted must be on public property or on property with free public access that is visible from or contiguous to transportation corridors, trails. These are 50-50 matching grants. So what that means is we'll match 50% of your overall expenditures, including things like the purchase and planting of trees and maintenance during the grant period, fees charged by contractors, site preparation costs, and the purchase of essential supplies and materials for trees. And Marlene will go into more detail about some specifics of what we can and cannot cover based on the sources of our funding. This is a signed agreement between the Maine Forest Service and you, the grantee. And the timeline depends on which type of grant you have. The planting and maintenance grants usually can be executed fairly quickly. So those are a 12-month grant timeline, whereas the planning and education grants can be a little bit more involved and require more planning. And therefore we give a bit more time, up to 18 months for execution of the planning and education grants. And then this is reimbursement-based funding. So for those of you that are with government grants that are reimbursement based, you may be more experienced with foundation grants where they pay you up front. That is not the case with these grants. Once these grants are awarded, recipients are reimbursed for satisfactory work completed within the grant time period as described in the original scope of the proposal. Grant funds are not provided up front. Final receipts for reimbursement must be submitted along with verification of your matching expenses or in-kind services. So as I just mentioned, the funding from these grants does primarily come from the USDA Forest Service, from the Community Forestry Assistance Program. The USDA Forest Service Urban and Community Forestry Program was authorized by the Cooperative Forestry Assistance Act of 1978 and revised by the 1990 Farm Bill, and has remained largely the same in subsequent versions of the Farm Bill. And it was designed to promote natural resource management in populated areas, recognizing the importance of trees and improving quality of life. We do have some supplemental funding to those core USDA Forest Service funds, and that is provided through funds collected related to enforcement action in support of tree planting. Usually those go to specific areas where that enforcement action took place. And then additionally, we do oftentimes have funds from either other grant sources from the USDA Forest Service, like the Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund. In this case, this year we have additional funds from the USDA Forest Service for doing more specific activities. In this case, this would be for supporting planning and response related to invasive forest pests. And for those of you on there that might be thinking, oh, I can use this for brown-tailed moth. No, that is not the case. But for the emerald ash borer specifically, we're hoping to support more communities that are proactively looking to manage for the emerald ash borer, now that we are seeing more expansion of that pest within the state. So I know this is a long slide. The purpose of these grants is to support community efforts to develop and maintain long-term community forestry programs. I say that like a million times through this, by raising public awareness, developing and maintaining partnerships, promoting comprehensive natural resource management, and then lastly, to increase the number of, I use in quotations, actively managing communities. And I'm going to define what that means. But this is one of those things when you write a lot of grants, you realize, when you write grants, you're trying to do something that you want to do, but you're also trying to help the funder achieve something that they need to do. So the Maine Forest Service has to report annually on communities that we define as actively managing. And that's what these funds are intended to do, to support communities reaching this status. So these grants are designed to help you move along the path to becoming an actively managing community. So the way the feds describe or define an actively managing community is a community that has professional forestry staff that can be contracted, on staff. It can be a volunteer, a community forestry advocacy group, tree ordinances or policies, an up-to-date tree inventory, and also an up-to-date community forestry master plan or management plan. So there is a form in the application to check off these items that you have already achieved. Timeline for this year, the grants were announced last month. We're doing the workshop today. Applications are due relatively shortly, March 11th, and no exceptions on that, I'm sorry to say. And then we anticipate making the awards by May 1st. Ideally, we'll be able to do that sooner so that you can get tree orders in for the spring, for spring planting. So again, the two different grant categories, planting and maintenance, planning and education. Now I'm going to go into some more detail about what these actually are. The planting and maintenance grant category is the more basic of the two categories. It's designed to bring in more communities that are just getting started with their community tree program, or just getting started doing grants with the Maine Forest Service. And they provide an excellent opportunity for communities to help increase tree cover, to improve tree health, to engage citizens and build support for their fledgling community tree program. It's not to say that they're exclusive to communities that are new to the program, but they're designed to be easier for new communities to get into. Some types of projects that would be included in this grant category: tree planting in high visibility areas where they make a direct and positive impact on the community, buffer plantings to filter air and water, limit stormwater runoff or stabilize soils, and then business district enhancements. The planning and education grants support a broader range of activities, but all in support of developing and maintaining that long-term community forestry program. Again, some examples include doing a street tree inventory, kind of a basic thing for, or a starting point for a long-term management program. Long-term planning for your street tree inventory. Figuring out where you have gaps in your tree canopy, where you have a lot of older trees that need to be replaced over time, and coming up with a strategy and the budget to support that eventual replacement. Developing a new tree board and tree ordinance development. And then forest management planning for publicly owned or accessible parcels in accordance with the Maine Forest Service Woods Wise or Woodland Resource Action Plan standards. And if you're not exactly sure what you want to do, but you want to do something, you're certainly encouraged to contact any of the people here on the call today. Contact Kim, your district forester, and we'll certainly discuss your project ideas. So the applications themselves, I'm going to run through each of the two types kind of back and forth here. This is the application form for the planning and education grant. The front page of your application. So on this, don't have a pointer going and I don't want to distract myself by doing that. But up at the top here, you've got your basic organizational information, just your contact information for us to include in our database. Put in here, who it is that you want us to be communicating with on an ongoing basis to see how your grant is going. Just underneath that, you have your total budget numbers. and you want to make sure that those numbers match those on page 5 of your application. Otherwise, we get very confused. And then down at the bottom, you want to do a project abstract. This is not your narrative description. If we don't have an accompanying narrative of, with much more detail, that application would be considered pretty much incomplete. There are a couple of other questions on there too about where the project will take place. Sometimes the organization that is in charge of the grant isn't actually in the same location as where the grant deliverables will be executed. So you want to make sure you tell us where the actions are taking place on the ground. And then also if your community has a comprehensive plan that's been certified by the state. For those of you that are nonprofit organizations, I encourage you to reach out to the community where this work is taking place and collaborate with them as much as possible and help to get some answers on some of these questions that may be more targeted towards actual municipal entities. This is the cover page for the planting and maintenance program. Again, a little bit more simplified. The cover page has both your budget and your basic community information. No abstract necessary for the planting and maintenance grants, but everything else is pretty much the same. Second page of both applications outlines the additional forms and information that we want to see with all applications. And that includes that narrative, which is the more thorough description of your project, your maintenance plan, if you're doing any planting, maps and photos that support your proposal, and then letters of support from partnering organizations. It's important to note here that the signatures are important. The applications must be signed by both the applicant as well as the official representative of your community or your organization. In the case of a town, that would be the town manager, the first selectman, executive director for nonprofit, etc. But essentially, the person who can officially accept the funds. So this is the budget for the planning and education grant. The budget's 3 pages, divided up into categories. There are 7 different categories for spending. On this page, you have consultants and services, educational and promotional supplies, and then trees planting and maintenance. With the planning and education grants, you can plant trees. It's just asked that it not be the primary focus of your grant. And if this happens a lot, where we have grant proposals that can be very complicated. For instance, one I remember recently where a community was doing an inventory, but that inventory was being conducted largely by volunteers. So there wasn't a large cost to doing the inventory. Most of that work was being provided in kind. But then additionally, they were asking for $10,000 worth of trees. And when we did oblige, it was a good project, but going through the planning and education grant isn't a workaround to that $8,000 budget cap. So in that case, we just scaled back their planting costs to the $8,000 maximum that is allowed under the planting and maintenance category. So on this budget form, column A is for your reimbursable expenses. Column B is for your non-reimbursable, your match. And then C is the sum of the two. It's important to note here that you do not need to match 50-50 per line item. Your match can come all in other categories. Page 2 of your budget is all for potential costs that you cannot request reimbursement for, but are very much welcomed as part of your applicant match. So on page 2, you have your administrative costs, volunteer labor, machinery or equipment that are donated, and then donated materials. Again, all encouraged for your local match. Rates are important. If you're using town or organizational staff, you're going to use what your established rate is, and that would be your fully burdened rate. For volunteers, you can use established rates for those services being provided. For instance, if you're planting trees or pruning trees, there are established rates through the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the state departments of labor. So I encourage you to research what those are. Or if they're just general volunteers serving time in committee meetings, helping organize, etc. There are rates that are established nationally as well as in the state. Not to say that you have to use those rates, but you want to use a volunteer rate that's consistent with the rate that you charge in other grants to other organizations. That is one of those things the auditors love to hone in on, if you're charging different rates for volunteers based on the organization. So just frame of reference, if you are using the independent sector, that first link there, you're going to find that the rate for Maine as of 2020, I believe it was right around $25 an hour, which is certainly a healthy rate to use. But again, be consistent. And if you're using students, you want to use a different rate, obviously. I generally encourage using minimum wage. And then on the final page, that's just where you're going to put any other costs that don't necessarily fit into those other categories. You're going to tally up columns A, B, and C. And again, those numbers on this page should match those on your cover sheet for the planning and education grant. And this is the planting and maintenance budget, very much simplified. You're limited to costs associated with purchasing trees, planting and maintenance, and then associated, supplies. So the block on the left-hand side is for your reimbursable expenses, and then on the right is for your non-reimbursable or your match. And then you're just going to tally those both up at the bottom. So then the narrative is something that you're expected to provide with either one of the grant categories. And both Marlene and I will spend a little bit of time on this. This is the bulk of your grant application, really. It's the opportunity for you to sell us on what it is you want to do. In it, you want to provide as much detail about what you hope to accomplish, including what you expect to be developed, produced, performed, or implemented. You should provide a work plan and a timeline for completion. You also want to explain how what you expect to do helps us reach our goals of developing a sustainable program for your community. How will this project help you manage the community tree resource better? How it will make the public more aware of the benefits of trees, and how you will work with partners. You, in this narrative is also your opportunity to describe how this project is going to enhance your ability to move towards becoming that actively managing community that I described earlier. And I encourage all of you to look at the grant application guidelines. Those are also on the website, and look at the scoring matrix, and make sure that you're hitting all of those points in the scoring matrix. We do have one new item in the scoring matrix this year, and that is how your project is going to make your community more resilient to climate change and the effects of climate change. So something new to think about, but we like to say trees are the answer. So then, if you are doing work on the ground, you want to make sure that you include a map and other visuals to help tell your story. It's pretty self-explanatory. Don't go crazy. I mean, any plans that you have, certainly include those, and you know, a few photos, but you don't have to go overboard and include a, you know, whole novel of photos for us to look through. Just a handful usually help tell your story quite well. If you're including any planting in your project, you want to include a 3-year maintenance plan. In that maintenance plan, you want to identify the individuals and the resources responsible for tree maintenance over 3 years, although only the maintenance costs during the grant period are allowed as part of your match. If those doing the maintenance are outside of your organization, it would be great if you could also include a letter of support from those individuals or organizations articulating that they are responsible for the maintenance. And that leads me to those letters of support. Letters of support are important. Again, you don't need to go overboard. Be more focused on substance from organizations or individuals that are providing something to your project. They should articulate specific commitments and contributions rather than just general statements of support. You know, we do get quite a few projects that come in with letters of support from, you know, various different U.S. senator and representative offices in support of, and those are great. And if you want to include those, certainly I won't reject them, but they don't mean as much as a letter from somebody saying that they're contributing something specific and they are committing to maintaining trees within this certain area for a period of time. And then lastly, just again, that actively managing community status. This is the checklist that goes along with that. So if you have these already in place in your community or your organization, if you could just check those off, it helps us tremendously at the end of the year when we have to do our grant reporting. So. Some final suggestions. I'm going to hand it over here to Marlene pretty quickly, so we're moving along pretty good. Some final suggestions: make the deadline. I'm very flexible about almost everything, but not that. So make sure I have it in my inbox by 5 p.m. Everything should be submitted electronically. Do your homework. If you're involving, you're purchasing trees, etc. You know, make sure you're getting some bids, looking at what the actual pricing is out there, not, you know, shooting in the dark. Make sure you're contacting the proper authorities within your community to ensure that you have gone through the steps that are necessary to request grant funding. And then lastly, just call with any questions. We're very happy to work with you and try to answer project specific questions. But before I hand it over to Marlene, because it gets kind of dense with the financial stuff, I just want to do a quick reminder of why we're all here and why it is that I run this program. I mean, it's because I love trees. This program is intended to plant trees and to grow the urban and community forest so that trees become community assets like the ones pictured here. It's also here to develop community natural areas and town forests for recreation, for wildlife habitat, water quality, and timber harvesting. The program is here to keep our community woodlands actively managed and open to the public, and to teach about the importance of these resources to everyone. And perhaps most importantly, it's about fostering relationships and encouraging participation in the care of our natural resources in our communities and across the landscape. So I'm going to keep running the slideshow Greg, do you want to open up to any questions at this point, or should we wait to the end?
There was just one question in the chat that I don't know if you want to take it now.
Can you read it to me, because I have
Yep. Oh, yeah.
I can't see the screen.
Yep, I'm keeping an eye on it. Yeah, it's from Megan in Orno. Can the timeline of completion be represented in table format?
Absolutely.
That was the only question that was in the
Okay, well,
chat.
if others have questions along the way, if you want to type them into the chat, otherwise we'll keep rolling here into Marlene's portion of the presentation, and lines at the end if you want to ask your question in another way than using the chat. So Marlene, take it off.
All right, thanks, Jan. All right, I'll be covering the grant rules of the road. So this is the list of the topics included in this section. A lot of them are just the guidelines that we follow for federal funds and making sure we're spending the money appropriately. So we'll be going over financial management, match, audits, grant documentation, reporting and monitoring, and other similar topics. So, all right, continuing on. Basically, the biggest issue is making sure that you document everything related to this grant.
Give me a second, Marlene.
Oh,
I'm trying
sure.
to get back to my screen that I can actually advance the slides.
Oh, sure.
Okay, I'm gonna, Greg, help. Where is it? Oh, there we go. Okay, I got it.
Got it?
Just tell me when to advance.
Yeah, okay. All right. We're going to be covering, what the grant could be used for, the CFDA, which is the guidance that we follow from the federal government, the deadlines for the funds, record keeping, match. Jan went over some of them, but we'll go into a little bit more specifics. All right, next slide is just some words that are related to the grants. So you may see those in some of the documentation or information that you look through that will be provided at the end. And some acronyms, just to be familiar with. Some of them you've probably already seen. A lot of them come from the Code of Federal Regulations, but a lot of other ones related to financial grants. All right, these are the umbrellas of authority: federal law, USDA Forest Service, cooperative forestry assistance. These grants are through the Urban and Community Forest Grant. Then we also have to follow any state laws and local laws in your different communities. Some could be overlapping, so you want to go with lowest restrictive laws. And again, they're guidelines pretty much to prevent you from getting into trouble and making sure you're spending the money appropriately. This is the website for the OMB circular if you want to dig into the details. But this is where we sort of gain all of our guidance from. All right. And what's included is mostly the administrative requirements, the cost principles of how you're spending your money, audit requirements, and then all that data collection that you should maintain to make sure you have it in your files should there be an audit down the road. The CFR is organized into these different subparts. So sections B through D cover the administrative requirements for grants and cooperative agreements. And section E covers the cost principles for allowable costs. And F is your single audit requirements. Conflict of interest. It's important to note that you must disclose any potential conflicts to avoid any federal issues down the road. Right. And this, again, just review of risks, making sure that you're noting that your subrecipients can't be debarred or suspended from working for federal government. So you need to make sure anyone supporting your grant is in accordance with all the laws and they haven't violated anything. And then one way to check that is making sure they have financial stability. They have quality management systems or a good history of their, or if there was an audit, that you know what the findings were. There's checklists available to help you look at what's needed to make sure that you're meeting the requirements and that your agency is covering those principles. Subpart D, post-award. This is once you receive your award. This guidance should help in tracking your performance and program activities and your financial tracking to include your expenses or any income and any internal controls of your organization, how you process payments and match, and you're making sure that all of the expenses are within the time frame of the approved grant. This covers your responsibilities for making sure that your grant activities are accurate and current, that you're identifying where your funds are coming from. So if you get part of this grant, you might keep a documentation that you received that federal grant money from this or Project Canopy grant, but then you might track where your other match is coming from. So for an audit, you would have all those details. And you want to make sure that any sub-grant awards are also tracked. You want to have a trace of all of your expenses and funds to make sure that you're following all of the federal statutes and regulations. You basically, in an audit, you want to be able to show how all your funds were spent and that you had the records to show for that. Let's see. So there are 7 primary characteristics of financial management systems listed below. Most government agencies have these and have most of these already covered, but if you're a smaller agency, it's important to just make sure you look at this, make sure there's a way to track and receive your expenses, be able to report on expenses that occurred during a time frame, that you have controls in place, and that you're following your written procedures that you have for your organization. This is the list of are your checks and balances, tracking separation of duties. In a smaller agency, you might be one person doing it all, but in this type of grant, you probably should have somebody else also seeing that, oh, okay, I've spent this, but this person approved it. It's just making sure that the funds are being spent appropriately. You want to be able to, some of this is kind of repetitive, but again, tracking your expenses. Maybe you have a chart of accounts that you can show different types of expenses by that different coding. That you have a clear audit trail, that you're just tracking all of the details and keeping things separate so that there's no question in the end that, yep, this was an expense directly related to this grant, but then it's not being used somewhere else with a different grant. Tracking your money, you want to be able to track everything related to that specific grant. You want to include the CFDA title and number whenever possible, and the fiscal year, the federal agency, and any other details that you might have to track the particular grant award. The details will help you provide that documentation trail for your records and for any future audits, should there be any. This is a blank form example of how to track your grant expenses. If you already have something you use, that's fine. This is more like if you don't have anything or you're wondering what type of things could be used. Could be a simple spreadsheet where you're tracking dates, name of the vendors or the purchases, activities, expenses, and maybe the match. You might have direct costs and match costs, and you can capture it all in this type of format. And if you have something else that tracks similar details but organized different, that's fine. This is an example of a completed spreadsheet. So you can see here, there's like examples of they spent money on tree planting, but also administration and brochure development. And they have some money spent directly on the grant and some on the in-kind, and they're tracking the totals at the bottom. These are 3 different forms that can be used to track the time worked on any federal grant. One is for volunteer, one is for salaried employee, and one is for the value of donated equipment. So if somebody to loan a piece of equipment that you use maybe to dig out a place that's where your tree planting is going to be, you could capture that detail of how much it costs, going back to the labor standards or the similar costs that it would if you contracted it out. So these are different forms used to be able to track your expenses and any donations, donated time, donated equipment.
Just to add, Marlene, those forms, they look like they're from the 1970s. They probably are from the 1970s, but they're up on the website to download if you want to use them. They're perfectly valid. And I have a lot of organizations and communities that do use those.
Oh, good.
But again, if you have your own system for tracking all of this stuff, please do not,
don't feel you have to use this. It's just a sample. Or if you have something similar, please, or use something that's more updated, or a spreadsheet or database, whatever you might have. Allowable costs should be necessary to the function of the grant, reasonable, allocable, and consistently applied. So you would not want to shift your grant award to some other type of cost that came up. You would need to spend it on what it was approved for, what you had asked for in the grant application. And allocable is the type of things that are needed to operate your grant. It might be part of what you're doing in your organization, but everything that's used for the grant should be related to the grant. Unallowable costs would be for expenses that were for purposes other than the grant or outside of the grant period. That would be either before or after the approved grant. Or maybe you spent something but you don't have any receipt or any documentation for it, or didn't follow the terms of what was in your application and approved grant, or maybe you didn't have enough match. So that's very important, because you can only be reimbursed for 50%. So if you spent more than that and didn't have match beyond 50%, you wouldn't be able to get that last reimbursement. Internal controls, which I had mentioned before, it's that separation of duties, looking at risk assessment. There's expectations that you are following your internal policies to your organization and following all of the federal guidelines that have been provided. More on internal controls. This is specifically over cash disbursements. Most organizations have multiple levels of approval to process expenses. So you want to review the documentation, make sure it's accurate, and make sure that the authorized person in your agency is signing for invoices or checks. Typically, a director wouldn't necessarily be the signer for everything. That's where you have your segregation of duties, where there's somebody else responsible for reviewing and checking and then signing, just to make sure not everything is all. Matching and cost sharing. They must be documented and be able to be verified. Other federal grants that you might receive cannot be used as match for another federal grant. So if you get another federal grant, that can't be matched for this. There are a few exceptions out there, but not for this particular Project Canopy grant. Program income is not used for match without prior approval. In-kind contributions can be used, though there's some details that it has to be related to the grant and hopefully been identified in your grant application. The Urban Community Forestry Program has a 50-50 match, and the total cost of your project will be your federal and match together, just like Jan had reviewed on the budget section of the grant application. And match used should be necessary to completing your project and reasonable within standards that would be used somewhere else. Donations could, you'd want to track that information on a form like the ones we provided, or something you have. Check with labor standards or another local contract that would charge that type of work, or the cost for an employee, and just keep a documentation of that. So it should be similar to what you would normally pay if it wasn't donated. And then property usually doesn't particular grant, but it's usually related to the fair market value. In-kind contributions, third-party non-cash, could be their time, equipment. It could even be, depending on what your grant is, it could be supplies or maybe other things related to what goes on in your office, but it has to be documented and related to the grant, and allowable under the grant. And again, we need to be able to verify the match in the end. When you apply for your reimbursement, you want to show that you have documented that match and that it relates. Program income. Non-federal entities are encouraged to earn the income to defray costs when you can, but it must be from a grant-supported activity, can't be from any fines or taxes, and you need prior written approval to use this. Audits. You're responsible for maintaining all the documentation, and should an audit occur, then you would provide that detail. The $750,000 is the fiscal year expenditure threshold, and then there's the website to review the federal audit details. What do they look for? That the costs that you incurred under the grant were eligible and allowable, excessive, that the dates of the expenses were within that grant period, that they're not charged to some other federal program, and that everything is consistent, properly documented, and that you follow your own policies. A grant file is definitely a good thing to have for your grant award. We keep our grant files in the Maine Forest Service, and this is a list of typical things that we keep in that file. You could keep your application, your grant award, any documentation of your expenses, your written policies, any match, any financial reports, anything related to the grant, really. And at the end, you can keep all your closeout documentation and reimbursement information there as well. And that could be electronically kept as well. In this time frame, there's less paper documentation. That's definitely still allowable, but an electronic file is also fine, as long as you can produce the information if needed.
Marlene, how long do they want to keep that on file?
Usually 3 years after the end of the grant. Once you've received all your reimbursements, you would want to maintain that for 3 years. And then after that, you would follow your own retention policies of how you might eliminate the extra files you have. You know, whether that's deleting it from your servers or shredding, or you would just follow your policies at that point. But at that point, you would be not required to maintain your grant, the grant file details. This is just a suggested grant multiple tab folder. Not required. So however you want to keep it is fine. It was just an easy way to keep track of, we'll keep all the correspondence in this tab or this folder, forms, financial payments, monitoring reports. So again, it's just a suggestion. Narrative statement, the sales pitch, that's what Jan had talked about earlier. Explaining your need of the project, your goals and objectives, and all your activities and timeline. And that can be kept with the grant file. That is an important document and can be looked at when requesting reimbursement, just to make sure it matches what your application said, what you intended to do. Equipment is, this is just the definition, tangible property useful for over a year, usually a cost of $5,000 or more. These are usually not authorized in the Project Canopy grant. There may be other federal grants that allow for it, but not in this case. Standards for documentation of your work performed. You want to keep track of all the official records, the activity for employees, federal and non-federal activities, distribution of wages, and especially if your organization gets more than one federal award or has other federal funds, you want to be able to that a way that specifies that they worked on this grant for this many hours in this pay period. Maybe they worked on Project Canopy for 10 hours, but they worked on a couple other federal grants for other hours. So being able to show that is important, to know that their hours were directly applicable to this specific grant. And the budget estimates alone are not used for support of work performed. You might compare, you budgeted this amount and then you spent a different amount, but that you would want to show the actual expenses of the employee time and any other like any volunteers that might have documented their time. If they're volunteering for other grants, they would want to specify the hours for the specific grant they worked on. A budget that's submitted can be revised and moved to different funding categories, but it requires prior written approval. There are times when you have unanticipated requirements or changes, and I think Jan even mentioned one earlier that they had to make some changes along the way. So if that happens, reach out, contact Jan or you have changes, and then we can look at what, does it still fit the original grant application? Do we need to modify anything? So Jan could weigh in at that time on any issues around that. So just know it can be changed, but needs prior approval. How to change your grant? Again, ask first. Your application is really your best estimate of what your intentions are, including your budget, but changes can happen. So communication and prior approval is required. And this could involve program changes in your scope of work or goals. Maybe you had a transition of some key people, or maybe a subcontractor isn't able to complete the work and that has to shift. Again, prior approval prior to the ending date of the grant. So yes, you would want to get this communicated and addressed before the grant ends. But as soon as you know, then we can work with you to figure out how to make the changes or what that means. Transfers can be made between budget categories if needed, and also any overhead or direct costs, and change in matching where a third party is involved. So any changes on any of those topics, you would just reach out with what your changes are, and then we'd help you with some direction on how that would affect your grant. All the grant revisions or even a grant extension of time requires pre-approval. It must meet the original program intent and be allowable from the program guidance. Usually it would require a strong justification. There are circumstances where that could come into play, but changes aren't just made routinely. They're usually unique situations. Where you're also following state and local laws, and your purchases should be necessary for the grant, competitive. So if you can get, supplies at 3 local stores are all kind of roughly the same, that might be the best way to go, as opposed to ordering some, expensive, cost twice the amount somewhere else. So competitive. You want to document any of your purchases, and a written conflict of interest policy. So if there's any conflict, you would just want to note that. Any procurement transactions should be competitive. That includes any of your micro purchases. Anything under 3,000 should be reasonable, with some possible competitive quotes, or at least comparative to what you might get it for. It's just to use tax dollars wisely and use your best, get the best purchase you can. And in some cases, you might need to have a sole source justified for an emergency or special circumstance, but that is usually discouraged. Monitoring your program performance. You are responsible for managing the grant and any sub-grant programs, functions, and activities. And those should be compliable with any federal reporting. And you want to track your achievement of your performance goals. At the end of the grant, you want to be able to report that you've done everything you listed on your application. The performance reports need to be submitted on schedule, and then the financial and programmatic report will be reviewed. So if you're tracking all your details and following your grant application, that report should be fairly straightforward, and just maybe explaining the results of your project and did you meet your goals at the end. Certification. Every report should be signed by an authorized official for your agency, just saying that they certify that this is true and complete. And the financial monitoring needs to have documentation for all expenses. That includes invoices, receipts, any purchases, contracts, any travel, time cards, again, all documented. And on the travel, you might have, how often a vehicle might have been used or was mileage reimbursed. So that could be tracked on a spreadsheet or however you track those details. And then you want to follow your local or state written procedures. And for procurement, get specs, bids, quotes, or in unique situations, keep track of your sole source justifications, any conflicts of interest, and track your time and attendance. The monitoring includes the compliance with the grant purposes, site visits, could be phone conversations or meetings face-to-face, training, written progress reports. So any of those sub-recipients or contractors that you have supporting you in your project, you want to monitor them and track this information to make sure they're on track, on target with meeting your goals and that you're getting what you asked for within the time frame of this grant. That's important just to And again, the benefit to monitoring your subrecipients, if needed, you could request technical assistance. You could showcase any successes, like pictures or send some documentation on success. But you're also ensuring that your projects are on track to complete what you want to complete. But it also improves communication or gives you time to correct any shortfalls or other issues that may come up. So it's definitely a key thing to track subrecipient work supporting your project. Couple things to watch out for supplementation is being careful of not diverting any of your approved specific grant funds to any other projects or expenses after you've received your grant approval. Consultants, you want to make sure that it's all fair market value, caution on sole sourcing, and match. You want to make sure that your match is met. And in this grant, you're going to submit your reimbursements at the end, but in some grants, spending it near the end might make it look like you're just trying to use the funds, but not spending it appropriately. Basically, you're going to complete the project as you planned in your grant description, and retain all those records that support that. This is the slide that shows that records must be retained for 3 years after the close of the grant period, which is the date of your final expenditure report that is submitted. Civil rights, USDA is prohibited from any grantees or sub-grantees are following this. Make sure you support that. And that's available on that link provided if you need to go into more details. So what we're looking for the grant application is the the project with your goals, your supporting your initiatives, and you have your budget with your narrative, and that your costs are necessary, reasonable, appropriate, and that you review subrecipient performance. So that's sort of, once you get your grant award and you start working on things, those are the things to pay attention to and make sure you're following. So that pretty much wraps up the grant rules of the road. Some of it's kind of dry and a little bit repetitive, but it's just to make sure you understand all of the federal requirements or expectations, because we wouldn't want anyone down the road to say, well, I didn't know or I didn't understand. So we're hoping that you get a good understanding of what's required in applying for your grant, in monitoring your grant, and I don't know if anyone has any specific grant related questions on the financial or grant rules of the road.
Yeah. If anybody wants to unmute their mics, you can feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you, or you can type questions into the chat too, if that is more comfortable for you. But thank you, Marlene, for going through all of that. Again, it's just to keep you guys on the right side of the law. Nobody here wants to be wearing an orange jumpsuit anytime soon. So I think I did see that somebody had a hand up, perhaps. John Bozak. John, did you want to ask a question? You're muted. Oh, I got you now.
Where do we? Oh my God.
Yeah, I'm not sure why we're getting that feedback. Marlene, maybe if you want to mute your mic too, or Greg, yeah.
Where do we access the application?
Yeah, John, I think if you turn down your speaker when you
Okay.
talk.
Where do we access our application forms?
We can get that web link right into the chat and you can go there from there. But everything should be up on the website, all the applications, the guidelines, the web recording of this presentation will be up there later if you need to go back and review anything, as well as the sample forms and contact information, etc. So, yep, Greg just dropped it up in the chat. So thanks for doing that, Greg.
Thank you.
And if you have any trouble finding it, some people do have trouble with our website. I don't know what it is. If you have trouble, just send me an email and I'll forward that along.
It looked like there was a question, what do you mean by subrecipient? So if you hire somebody to work on your grant project, maybe it's you're hiring somebody to dig out the earth so you can plant a tree, or someone to deliver a tree, then you might be paying them for service. That's just an example. I mean, Jan might have more to add to that.
I'm sorry, I was reading another question, but yeah, subrecipient would be, I mean, in some cases, although I will say subrecipients are fairly rare with these grants, you might be providing, a portion of your grant funds to another organization to complete some part of the project, Youth Conservation Corps or something along those lines. And it would just be, ensuring that you're monitoring the use of those funds just as we monitor the use of funds that we provide to the communities as part of these grants. I do see a question in the chat about, would a project relative to brook trout habitat protection be an appropriate project for which to seek funding, or is this just for community tree planting? And I would say, Becky, that is one of those answers that everybody loves. It depends. It really, the program funds here are for planting in more community type settings. It's not to say that a public or community forest isn't a place where we would plant for habitat restoration protection, but it will depend on the involvement from the community and how that deliverable will impact the community. So, I mean, I can think of a lot of scenarios where that would work, but it really is going to depend a lot on how that project is framed up as being a rural community asset. So that would be one I would suggest giving us a shout, and we can talk about it. Oh, some questions or comments about the pictures. Yeah, the pictures are all over the place in there, but there are definitely some things that are not safe. Any other questions? All right, well, seeing time, I look forward to seeing your applications. Certainly give us a shout if you have questions. Would rather answer questions and help you develop a good project proposal before we receive the application. And we do have a question here. If our town is working on a comp plan, does this qualify as having a comp plan? Our last plan was in 2005. For that question, I would say that you will answer 2005 because I mean, I am the person who reviews the comp plans for the Maine Forest Service. Generally, Greg has a role in that too. It's a fairly lengthy process to develop a new comp plan. And, it may not be that the first draft of the comp plan even gets approved by the state. Maybe a couple back and forth to get that comp plan approved. So I would use that 2005 date as the state certified date. And that suffices to meet that scoring element in the review of the proposals. So. If you are, looking for that information too, I have access to it as well, but I definitely encourage you to reach out to your town office to answer questions about comp plans. If my community received a USDA grant last year, would that hurt my chances of obtaining this grant? If another USDA grant, not through this program, Gary, no, that is not something we take into account. The only reason that we will reduce points based on other grants is if you already have an existing open Project Canopy grant that is not closed out. And that's not to say that you can't receive another one. You can have multiple grants open at one time. Oftentimes, projects are much more comprehensive, and I didn't answer this question earlier, but I've usually get it. Can we apply for 2 grants at one time? Can we apply in both categories? Because sometimes you're really gung-ho and you want to get going, you want to do your inventory and management plan. and also do a whole bunch of planting within the same time frame. You can apply for both, but if competition is severe and we're limiting funding, we typically would come back and ask you which one you want to start with. So that's something, again, I would encourage you to think about when you're developing these proposals, which one you would give priority to if you are actually applying for 2 grants at one time. So if there's no more questions, we'll wrap it up. Again, this recording will be up on the website probably later this afternoon, and reach out to us if you have any questions or you need any material. So thanks all for spending a couple hours with us, and good luck.